It was just a family photograph, yet the woman's glove hid a terrible secret. With calm hands, Dr. Amelia Richardson gently unwrapped the paper around the wooden frame. Her grip steady, but her heart racing with anticipation. It was an October morning in 2024, and she stood in her office at the American Heritage Institute in Richmond, Virginia, where she was a senior curator of post-Civil War African American history. The package had arrived 3 days earlier, with no return address, just a small piece of paper. "This is from my family. I believe it deserves to be seen and understood. Please tell her story." The photograph emerged from the unwrapping, housed in an ornate Victorian frame with intricate carvings. The image was remarkably well preserved for its age, a studio portrait, 1875. The photographer's mark was watermarked in the lower corner, J. Morrison, portrait artist, Richmond, VA. The photograph shows a black family of 6, arranged in the formal, familiar style of the period. A man in his 40s stands in the center, one hand resting on a carved chair. Beside him, a woman of the same age sits upright, her posture dignified and composed. 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, ages 6 to 16, are arranged around them, neatly dressed, displaying a sense of well-being and care. Amelia has seen hundreds of such photographs in her career. In the decade after the Civil War and emancipation, black families who achieved freedom and economic stability often commissioned official portraits. The photographs were a statement, a visual testimony of dignity, success, and humanity, a powerful counterpoint to the dehumanizing rhetoric that persisted after slavery. But the moment she saw this one, Amelia knew something was different. The family's clothing was typical of the upper classes of 1870. The father in a tailored suit, the children in formal attire. But the central figure wore an unusual detail, a long glove reaching past the elbow almost to the shoulder, tucked under the 3/4 sleeves of a luxurious dress. The glove appeared to be made of smooth kid leather or dark-dyed silk, matching the dress. In those days, portrait gloves usually reached only to the wrist or mid-forearm at most. So why was this glove so long? Amelia looked up at the woman's face. Her expression was gentle and dignified, but her eyes held a depth of experience, seeming to look through the lens straight at Amelia across nearly a century and a half. Her left hand rested in her lap, the fingers of the glove carefully folded. Her right hand rested on the arm of the chair, the glove taut and snug. Why is the glove so long? Amelia wondered. Is it just fashion, or is there something deliberately hidden? She flipped the photo over. The ink was faded, but it was still legible. Family, Richmond, Virginia, June 1875. Never forget. Amelia snapped a photo of the text on her phone and returned her gaze to the photo. There was a feeling, an intuition honed by years of historical research, that this photo held a deeper story than met the eye. For the rest of the day, Amelia tried to trace the photo's origins. The anonymous sender had left no contact information, and the postage stamp only said it was from Richmond. Without a family name, she had to rely on the photo itself and Richmond's 1875 historical records. She started with J. Morrison, the studio mark on the photo. In the Institute's extensive database, Amelia found a few records of James Morrison, a Scottish immigrant who opened a photography studio in Richmond in 1867. Morrison's studio was on Broad Street and served both white and black clients, unusual at the time when many photographers refused to photograph black people or discriminated against them. Morrison's business records, partially archived at the Virginia Historical Society, show that he was a successful photographer until his death in 1881. His studio was known for its high quality and somewhat progressive attitude, which may have been why a wealthy black family chose him to capture their image. But the records don't reveal the specific identities of the family in the photo. Morrison's appointment book and guest list appear to have been lost to time, possibly destroyed in one of the fires that ravaged Richmond's business district in the late 19th century. Amelia returned to the photo itself, scanning it at the highest resolution her equipment would allow. She loaded the digital file into her computer and used specialized software to enlarge it, adjusting the contrast, revealing details invisible to the naked eye in the original print. As she zoomed in on each section, she began to notice tiny, subtle features, soft yet strange details that only increased the questions. Do you see it? A glove that's too long? Could it be a sign of something deeper? A hidden pain? A shame that needs to be kept secret? And if there really is a mystery there, who sent this photo and why would they want it in the hands of a museum? Nearly a century and a half later, Amelia continued to watch, pixel by pixel, like someone listening to the memories of someone who had fallen asleep. The small details kept her staring, and the question, soft as a whisper in the night, echoed in her mind. Was there something the glove was trying to hide? The father's hands, bare and visible, carried the rough calluses of hard labor, the quiet evidence of a man who had worked with his hands, perhaps a craftsman or a tradesman. The children's faces held that tender mix of pride and nervousness, so often seen in young people posing for their first portrait, an occasion that must have felt both rare and momentous. Yet, despite all these details, Amelia's eyes kept returning to the mother and to those gloves. As she adjusted the image, deepened the contrast, and brought the lighting into sharper focus, something new began to appear. The surface of the gloves was not entirely smooth. There were faint, uneven patches, small bulges, and indentations, as though something beneath the fabric disturbed its perfect form. Amelia leaned closer, her breath slow. On the left wrist, the glove seemed to strain slightly. Under enhanced light, a faint texture appeared, subtle, irregular, the kind that did not belong to silk or skin untouched by harm. She moved to the right arm, and the same pattern emerged. The gloves fit well, perhaps even tailored, but they could not hide everything. Something beneath them remained, something scarred. Amelia sat back in silence, her mind flickering through possibilities. Burns, illness, or something far worse, something that might explain why a woman in 1870 would take such care to hide her arms in a photograph meant to celebrate her family's success and dignity. She reached for her phone and called Dr. Marcus Chen, a colleague at Virginia Commonwealth University. Marcus specialized in the forensic analysis of historical photographs, an expert at seeing what time had tried to erase. "Marcus," she said quietly when he answered, "I found something unusual. A photograph from 1875. I think you'll want to see it. Send it over." He replied, his tone instantly alert. "I'll take a look this afternoon." 3 days later, Marcus arrived at the museum with his portable analysis equipment. He worked carefully, setting up the scanner under controlled light. "It's beautiful," he murmured as the image appeared on his screen. Morrison really knew what he was doing. The exposure, the composition. Look how perfectly they're posed. Long exposure times meant everyone had to hold completely still. Even the smallest movement would have blurred the image. Amelia nodded. Yes. But what I want you to focus on are the gloves. There's something about them that doesn't sit right. When the scan was complete, Marcus stitched the image into a high-resolution composite and opened it on his laptop. The two leaned in together, the quiet hum of the equipment filling the room. Marcus began applying layers of digital filters, contrast enhancement, infrared mapping, surface texture analysis. Gradually, hidden patterns began to take form beneath the gloves. This is fascinating, Marcus murmured, his professional curiosity giving way to something more somber. Amelia, look here. He pointed to the screen to the faint parallel lines that appeared beneath the glove's surface. And here, those circular marks near the wrist. Amelia's voice was barely above a whisper. Restraint injuries, she said. Shackles. Marcus nodded gravely. And higher up, see these lash scars. Multiple wounds healed over time but deep. Permanent. The room fell silent. The elegant gloves that once seemed a mere eccentric fashion choice were suddenly revealed for what they were: a deliberate concealment. A quiet act of survival. She was enslaved, Amelia said softly. These are the marks left by bondage, the scars of punishment, of being treated as property. Marcus continued his work recording the findings with scientific precision. His software could even estimate the depth and age of the scars based on how they affected the texture visible through fabric. Judging from the healing patterns, he said, after a while, these injuries were sustained over many years. The most recent probably dates to at least a decade before this photograph, before 1865. Before emancipation, Amelia whispered. She opened her notebook, scanning her notes on Richmond's Civil War years, the Confederate capital where thousands of enslaved men and women had suffered under brutal conditions, especially in the final, desperate years of the war. After 1865, many stayed or returned, trying to build lives from the wreckage. Now, looking again at the photograph, Amelia saw it with new eyes. This image, taken in 1875, just 10 years after freedom, showed a family that had risen above the past. They wore fine clothes, they sat proudly before the camera, determined to be seen as whole, dignified and free. And yet, beneath that composure, the mother carried the permanent traces of what she had survived. The two researchers sat in heavy silence, the screen's light casting soft shadows across the room. The gloves, once symbols of elegance, had become something else, a shroud of history, hiding pain that had no other place to rest. Amelia wondered how many other photographs, how many quiet faces still carried untold stories like this one. And if those gloves could speak, what would they say about pain endured, about strength reclaimed, about the cost of being free? Why did she choose to hide the scars so completely? It's a question that lingered in Amelia's mind long after the first time she saw the photograph. In private, perhaps the woman had worn long sleeves out of habit or comfort. But this was a formal portrait. Something meant to last, to speak across generations. She could have chosen to reveal the scars to let them tell their story of pain and endurance, as many who had survived slavery once did. Yet she didn't. Every inch of her arms was hidden, as though the very memory of her suffering had to be gently veiled. To understand that choice, to uncover what the photograph wasn't saying, Amelia needed to know who they were. So late at night, beneath the dim light of her study, she began her search through Richmond's records from the 1870s, the decade after the Civil War, when the city's African American community was beginning to rebuild, to dream, to live. It wasn't easy. The archives were patchy, whole lives reduced to fragments or left unrecorded. Many black families had no mention at all or just a name without a story. But Amelia was patient. She started with property records, reasoning that a family wealthy enough for a professional portrait must have owned their own home. And so she read, name after name, tracing the faint lines of freedom through the deeds of the newly emancipated. To her quiet astonishment, the list was longer than most would imagine. Hundreds of formerly enslaved people had managed through grit and faith to buy homes in the decade after emancipation. Amelia cross-referenced property owners with business licenses looking for craftsmen for the roughened hands she had noticed in the father's portrait. The hands of someone who built, who worked, who created. The Freedmen's Bureau records, fragile and faded, offered hints, glimpses of men and women carving new lives from the wreckage of the old world. After 3 long days, she found him. Daniel Freeman. In 1871, he had purchased a modest house on Clay Street in the heart of Jackson Ward, a neighborhood soon to become the beating center of black life in Richmond. A carpenter by trade, just as Amelia had suspected. The deed mentioned his wife Clara and 4 children, Elijah, Ruth, Samuel, and Margaret. The ages aligned with those in the photograph. But it was another document that made Amelia's breath catch: a marriage application dated 1865. Daniel Freeman, described as a colored freeman, had applied to legally marry Clara, formerly enslaved, last held by R. Hartwell of Lancaster County. Beneath a section marked distinguishing marks, someone had written severe scarring on both arms from restraints and punishment. Amelia closed her eyes. There she was, Clara Freeman, the woman in the gloves. The woman who had survived unimaginable cruelty and yet had chosen in her portrait not to show her pain, but her dignity. Clara had been enslaved in Lancaster County, Virginia's tobacco country, where the Hartwell family once held vast plantations. The records said little about them, but what Amelia did find told of Clara's quiet resilience. By 1870, Clara and Daniel were living in a rented home, Daniel working as a carpenter. 5 years later, they owned their house. By 1880, Daniel had built his own business, and the older children were in school, a triumph few could have imagined for a woman once enslaved. But Amelia wasn't finished. She wanted to find their descendants to bring Clara's story full circle. So she posted inquiries online, sent letters, reached out to genealogy groups who preserved African American family histories in Virginia. 2 weeks later, an email arrived. It was from a woman named Dorothy Freeman Williams, a retired teacher from Washington, D.C. She was Clara and Daniel's great-great-granddaughter. "I've been researching my family for years," Dorothy wrote. "When I saw your post about a portrait from 1875, I knew it had to be the one my grandmother told me about, the portrait Clara insisted on having made even though it cost so much. I have letter stories, things passed down for generations. I'd love to share them with you." Amelia read the message twice, her heart beating faster with every line. The next morning she wrote back, and they arranged to meet at the museum, the place where a photograph, long silent, had finally begun to speak again. The following week, Dorothy arrived at the museum carrying a worn leather portfolio, the kind that had clearly been cherished and protected for generations. She was a dignified woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, but when her gaze fell upon the photograph resting on Amelia's desk, her expression changed. "That's them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's my great-great-grandparents and their children." Her eyes glistened with tears. "I've heard about this photograph my whole life, but I've never actually seen it. After my grandmother passed in 1983, we lost track of where the original went. One of my cousins must have donated it. And now here it is." She sat down, carefully opening the portfolio as though revealing a sacred relic. Inside were yellowed papers tied together with an old ribbon. My grandmother, Ruth Freeman. The girl standing on the right in this photograph, she told me Clara's story many times. She wanted to make sure no one ever forgot. Dorothy unfolded a fragile document, the paper soft with age, but the ink still alive. "This," she said quietly, "is something Clara wrote herself. In 1889, 14 years after the photograph was taken. She had only just learned to read and write. It was forbidden during slavery, you know. But she was determined. And one of the first things she did was tell her story." Amelia's hands trembled as she accepted the pages. The handwriting was slow, deliberate, each letter shaped with the care of someone who had fought for the right to write her own name. It began simply, "My name is Clara Freeman. I was born Clara Hayes in 1831 on the Hartwell plantation in Lancaster County, Virginia. I do not know the exact date of my birth, for such things were not recorded for enslaved people. But I was told I was born in spring, when the tobacco was being planted." Amelia read silently, her heart heavy. The words continued. "I lived in bondage to the Hartwell family until I was 33 years old. I worked in the fields from the time I was 6 until the day I escaped during the confusion of the war. I married my first husband when I was 16, a man named Joseph, but he was sold 2 years later. We had a daughter who died of fever before her first birthday. The Hartwells were not kind. When I was 14, I tried to run away to find my mother, who had been sold to North Carolina. I was caught after 3 days. They chained my wrists and ankles for 6 months. The metal bit into my skin, leaving scars I carry still. I was whipped many times for working too slowly, for speaking when not spoken to, for trying to learn to read. By the time I was 30, my arms were covered in scars from wrist to shoulder, proof of what they did to us and what I survived." Amelia paused, staring at the delicate loops of Clara's handwriting. Across the desk, Dorothy watched her, understanding the weight of those words. When Amelia finally looked up, Dorothy spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "Clara escaped in 1864, she said. Richmond was under siege, then chaos everywhere. The Hartwell plantation was crumbling. Most of the men had already fled or joined the Union Army. Clara saw her chance and took it. She walked for 3 weeks, hiding by day, traveling by night. When she finally reached Richmond, she found safety with Union troops. From her portfolio, Dorothy pulled another document, a faded certificate, edges frayed with time. This, she said, is the paper that made it official, her freedom. April 1865. She smiled faintly. She was 34 years old, and it was the first time in her life she was truly free. That's when she met Danielle, Amelia murmured. Dorothy nodded. Yes, Danielle was a free man born that way. His parents had purchased their freedom decades earlier in the 1820s. He was a carpenter helping rebuild the city after the fires. They met at a church service, and within 3 months, they were married. Dorothy reached for another sheet of paper, a letter, its script more practiced and elegant. This one was written by Daniel to his sister in 1870. She unfolded it gently and began to read. Clara is the strongest woman I have ever known. She endured horrors I cannot imagine. Yet she meets each day with grace. She works harder than anyone tending our home, raising our children, and helping me with my trade. But she carries her past quietly. She never lets anyone see her arms uncovered. She makes long sleeves for every dress and wears gloves whenever she goes out. She says the scars remind her too much of what she lived through. And she will not let our children grow up seeing those marks and thinking of their mother as a victim. She wants them to see her as whole, as strong. Amelia felt her throat tighten. The words blurred on the page as tears welled in her eyes, not just for Clara, but for the silence she had endured and the strength it took to turn that silence into love. The photograph at last made complete sense. Clara had worn those long gloves not from shame, but as an act of quiet defiance. She refused to let the scars of her enslavement decide how her children or history would remember her. "Tell me about the photograph," Amelia asked softly. Dorothy smiled through her tears. It was Clara's idea, she said. In 1875, they finally owned their home. All 4 children were healthy. The carpentry business was doing well. And Clara told Daniel she wanted a portrait, a formal one, something that would last. Dorothy paused, her voice trembling slightly. She wanted proof. Proof that a woman once treated as property could rise, could build, could love. She wanted the world to see her family's dignity, their strength, their humanity. From her portfolio, Dorothy pulled another slip of paper, a fragile receipt from J. Morrison's photography studio, dated June 15th in 1875. The cost, $5. Nearly a week's wages for a skilled carpenter. Clara insisted on going to Morrison, Dorothy said. He was known for treating black clients with respect. She chose her finest dress and asked Daniel to commission special gloves tailored by hand. She wanted every detail to be perfect. Amelia traced her finger over the photograph's faded inscription. "May we never forget?" What did she mean by that? She asked quietly. Dorothy smiled, though her eyes were shining. My grandmother explained it to me. Clara meant it for us, her descendants. She wanted us to remember where we came from. Not just the suffering, but the strength. To remember that freedom is precious. Because she knew what it felt like to live without it. She wanted us to understand that no matter the scars we carry, we have the right to define ourselves on our own terms. As Amelia and Dorothy worked together in the weeks that followed, more of Clara's story, unfolded letters, documents, memories passed down through 5 generations. Each fragment added another layer to the woman behind the gloves. One of the most revealing discoveries was a diary written by Ruth Freeman, the young girl, standing on the right in the photograph, who would grow up to be Dorothy's great-grandmother. Ruth had begun writing in 1880 at just 15 years old. Her words were simple, but filled with love and awe. Mama never talks much about her life before freedom, Ruth had written in 1881. But sometimes at night, when she thinks we're asleep, I hear her crying softly. I once asked about the scars on her arms. I'd seen them by accident when she was washing. She told me they were reminders of a past that no longer had power over her. She said she could look at them and see cruelty, or she could look at them and see strength. She chooses strength. She says she covers them, not from shame, but so that people will see her as she is now, not as she was forced to be then. Another entry written in 1883 revealed something deeper, the fierce love that drove Clara's life forward. Mama says education is our freedom. She walks us to school every morning and speaks with our teachers every week. She says that reading and writing were once forbidden to her, and she will never allow that kind of darkness over her children. Papa says she reads better than most people who went to school all their lives. She devours every newspaper and writes down our family stories so that we'll never forget where we came from. Amelia's research uncovered still more traces of Clara's legacy. Church records from Richmond's First African Baptist showed her name again and again, listed among the women who helped form a mutual aid society for those newly freed. She had become a quiet leader offering help, guidance, and comfort to women, building lives out of ruin. In the church archives, Amelia found minutes from a meeting dated 1878. The words leapt from the page. Mrs. Freeman spoke powerfully of her journey from bondage to freedom. No details were recorded, but the meaning lingered. A woman who had once been silenced, now standing before others, her voice steady, her scars hidden, not in shame but in sovereignty. And so the photograph, that small silent rectangle of time, had held all of it. The pain, the survival, the quiet rebellion. Clara Freeman had not simply posed for history. She had stared straight into its eyes and redefined it. The notes from that old meeting recorded something unforgettable. Clara had told the young women gathered before her, "The scars we carry, whether they can be seen or not, are not signs of our defeat. They are the proof that we survived." She urged them to hold their heads high, to demand respect, and to build lives shaped by their own choices, not by the cruelty that had once shaped them. Dorothy had saved one last piece of the story, a letter written by Clara to her daughter Ruth in 1890, when Ruth was preparing for her wedding. It was both tender and profound, a mother's voice, reaching across time. "When your father and I married," Clara wrote, "I was broken in many ways. My body bore the marks of cruelty, and my spirit had been bent by years of having no say over my own life. Your father could have turned away from those scars or from the weight of my past. Instead, he saw me as I longed to be seen, as a woman of strength and dignity, capable of building something new." That photograph we had taken when you were young, do you remember it? I wore the long gloves, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted that portrait to show us as we truly were. Not as people shaped by slavery, but as a family born into freedom, ready to define our own future. The scars are real, Ruth, but they are not all that I am. I am a wife, a mother, a neighbor, a woman who survived, who built beauty out of ashes. As Amelia prepared the exhibition about the Freeman family photograph, she felt the weight of that legacy. She wanted every visitor to see more than just a picture, to understand the history pulsing beneath it. To do that, she reached out to Dr. Marcus Bennett, a historian who specialized in slavery and Reconstruction in Virginia. Together, they uncovered the broader truth of the world Clara had endured. In Virginia alone, nearly 500,000 people had been enslaved before emancipation. Life on tobacco plantations like the Hartwell estate was brutal beyond imagination. Enslaved men and women worked from sunrise to sunset with barely enough food to survive living under constant threat of punishment. Whippings were routine, administered not only for disobedience, but for the smallest acts of resistance, or sometimes for no reason at all. Shackles were used to crush the spirit of those who dared to dream of escape. The scars on Clara's arms were not unusual. They were common marks among those who had survived such violence, especially among those who had dared to assert their own will. Marcus helped Amelia see that while Clara's story was deeply personal, it was also tragically universal. She stood for millions whose names had been forgotten, whose stories were never written down. But Amelia also wanted the exhibition to show what came after the suffering, the triumph that followed emancipation. Richmond in the years after the Civil War had become a center of black life and resilience. By 1870, the city thrived with black-owned businesses, churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. People who had once been enslaved now stood as craftsmen, teachers, ministers, and property owners. The Freeman family was part of that rebirth. Daniel's carpentry business flourished. By 1880, he employed 3 other men and worked on major construction projects across the city. The family moved to a larger home. All 4 children were educated beyond the basics. Ruth and Margaret trained to become teachers, while Elijah and Samuel learned skilled trades. Clara herself had learned to read, to write, and remarkably to manage the family's business accounts. City records listed her by 1885 as a property owner in her own right, the landlord of a small house she had bought to earn extra income. She had turned endurance into enterprise. Dorothy showed Amelia a fragile newspaper clipping from 1888, a short article celebrating Richmond's successful black entrepreneurs. There in print was Clara's name. Her words were simple yet powerful. "We have built something here that no one can take from us, not wealth, but dignity. Not comfort, but freedom. My children were born free. They will raise their children free. That is worth more than gold." And so on a warm spring evening in May 2025, the American Legacy Museum opened its doors to an exhibition titled Hidden No More, the story of Clara Freeman and the Long Gloves. The room was softly lit, the air filled with quiet reverence. At the center stood the photograph itself. Clara, proud and poised, her gloved hands folded with quiet grace. On a nearby screen, a careful digital analysis revealed what the gloves had hidden: the scars that once told a story of pain, now transformed into a story of endurance. Panels along the walls traced the Freeman family's journey, from bondage to freedom, from struggle to triumph. Visitors moved slowly, whispering as if afraid to disturb the silence of history. Near the entrance stood Dorothy Freeman Williams, surrounded by her family. More than 20 descendants had come to honor the woman whose strength had shaped them all. And as Amelia watched them standing there, 5 generations of Clara and Daniel's legacy, she realized something profound. The photograph had begun as one woman's act of defiance, but tonight it had become something larger, a living testament to survival love and the enduring power of memory. The Freeman family had flourished across generations. Teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, business owners, all carrying forward the legacy of resilience and achievement that Clara had begun. The gallery was alive that evening, packed with over 400 people. Historians, community members, descendants of formerly enslaved families, students, journalists. Local and national media had followed the story, drawn by the marriage of cutting-edge technology revealing hidden history and the profoundly human story at its center. Amelia stepped up to the podium. Behind her, the photograph loomed large, Clara's composed face staring back, her long gloves still holding their quiet secret. She began, slowly, deliberately letting the weight of the years settle over the room. For 149 years, this photograph has existed as a beautiful portrait of a successful black family in post-Civil War Richmond, she said. But modern technology allows us to see what Clara Freeman deliberately chose to conceal the physical scars of the brutality she survived. Yet, in understanding what she hid and why she hid it, we discover something even more powerful, her profound act of self-definition and resistance. Clara did not hide her scars because she was ashamed. She hid them because she refused to be defined by them. She wanted this photograph a permanent record of her family, to show not what had been done to her in slavery, but what she had built in freedom. She wanted her children and all future generations to see her as a woman of strength, dignity, and achievement. Amelia gestured toward the family members gathered in the gallery. Clara's descendants are here tonight, living proof of what she and Daniel built. Educators, physicians, business leaders, artists, activists. People who have achieved things Clara herself denied education and opportunity for most of her life could only dream of. Yet all carry forward the values she embodied: resilience, dignity, self-determination, and commitment to family and community. Dorothy stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the emotion in her eyes. My great-great-grandmother Clara died in 1904 at the age of 73, she said. In her final decades, she saw her children grown and successful, her grandchildren born into a world vastly different from the one she had known. She saw her community thrive even as Jim Crow laws and rising oppression threatened to erase what they had built. Family stories say that near the end of her life, Clara was asked whether she regretted hiding her scars in that photograph rather than displaying them as proof of survival. She reportedly replied, "I wanted the world to see what we built, not what they tried to break." The scars were real, but they were not the truth of who I was. The truth was in my freedom, my family, my dignity. That is what I wanted the photograph to show. Dorothy's voice broke and a hush fell over the room. Today we honor Clara by telling her full story, the suffering she endured, and the strength she embodied. We honor her by showing both what was hidden and what was proudly displayed. And we honor her by continuing to build on the legacy she established, refusing to be defined by what has been done to us, always moving forward with dignity and determination. The exhibition remained open for 8 months and welcomed over 50,000 visitors. It sparked conversations about memory trauma and the ways individuals and communities define themselves in the aftermath of oppression. The photograph became iconic, reproduced in textbooks, documentaries, and educational materials about African American history and the post-Civil War era. Amelia wrote an article for a major academic journal arguing that historical photographs often carry hidden stories, not just in what is shown, but in what the subjects chose to conceal or reveal. The Clara Freeman photograph became a case study in how modern technology, careful historical research, and family narratives could uncover stories that had existed for generations but had never been fully told. The American Legacy Museum established the Clara Freeman Research Fellowship funding scholars studying the experiences of formerly enslaved women and their strategies for survival resistance and rebuilding life after emancipation. Dorothy Freeman Williams donated additional family documents and artifacts, ensuring Clara's story would continue to be preserved with depth and accuracy. 6 months after the exhibition opened, Amelia received a letter from a woman in North Carolina. She had visited the exhibit and inspired researched her own family history. She discovered that her great-great-grandmother had also been enslaved on the Hartwell plantation at the same time as Clara. She included a photograph from 1880, her ancestor, standing with her family, also wearing long gloves despite the summer heat. Reading Clara's story helped me understand my own ancestor's choice, the letter read. I always wondered about those gloves in the photograph. Now I understand that she too was making a statement, not hiding in shame, but asserting her right to be seen as she wished. Amelia realized then why Clara's story resonated so deeply. It was universal. The human desire for dignity, the right to self-definition, and the complex balance between remembering trauma and moving forward. Clara had not denied her past. She had simply refused to let it be the only lens through which she was seen. One quiet afternoon, months after the exhibition opened, Amelia stood alone in the gallery. She looked at the photograph that had started it all and thought of Clara. The courage, the careful choice to cover her scars, the life built with purpose and meaning. And for the first time in a long while, Amelia felt the story settle fully into her heart, a story of survival strength and a legacy that would endure for generations. The photograph had always seemed simply a family portrait, a frozen moment of post-Civil War prosperity. Yet now, it revealed so much more. It was a testament to survival, an act of quiet resistance, a declaration of dignity, and a bridge across generations. Clara's gloves had hidden her physical scars, but in doing so, they had preserved a greater truth about who she was. Not merely a survivor of slavery, but a woman who had built a life of freedom of family and of community. Behind Amelia, a group of middle school students entered the gallery, their teacher guiding them slowly through the story. Amelia watched as the children absorbed the photograph, their faces a mix of curiosity and wonder. One girl raised her hand, her voice hesitant but earnest. "Did Clara ever take off the gloves?" she asked. "Did she ever let people see her arms?" The teacher smiled softly. According to family accounts, Clara had been deliberate in when and how she revealed her scars. She showed them to her children once they were old enough to understand, using them as lessons about history, resilience, and the strength of those who had come before. She showed them to other formerly enslaved women in her community, quietly building solidarity, understanding, and shared memory. But she chose the timing, the audience, and the context herself. That choice, the teacher explained, was itself an expression of her freedom. The students nodded thoughtfully, glancing back at the photograph with a new awareness. Amelia's mind drifted to the note that had arrived with the photograph so many months ago. Please tell her story. That simple request had opened a window into a remarkable life, unveiling a truth hidden and preserved for 149 years. Clara Freeman's story was no longer just the story of what she had endured, it was the story of how she chose to be remembered. The long gloves in the photograph were no longer a mere fashion choice. They were a profound statement of self-determination. They were a reminder that healing from trauma does not require displaying one's wounds, and a testament to the fact that true freedom includes the power to define oneself on one's own terms. As visitors continued to move quietly through the gallery, pausing to examine the photograph and read Clara's story, Amelia understood at last what Clara had wanted all along. Not to hide the truth, but to ensure that anyone looking at the portrait would see the full truth, not only survivors of slavery, but builders of freedom, dignity, and enduring legacy. The gloves had concealed Clara's scars, but the photograph, fully understood, had preserved her story. And finally, that story was being told with the depth, respect, and understanding it had always deserved.